are just about in silly season and everyone's schedule is quite busy and the workload is increasing, and office parties and working lunches are starting to pick up. So thank you so much for taking time out of your busy schedule and being here today. Just also a word of welcome to Virginia Hollis, the chair of the MRF, the chairperson of the MRF, and the board members who've been instrumental in getting us off the ground as the MRF, but also this model that we're working on. Their continued support and guidance has really been instrumental in getting us to this point. There are also a number of BMR colleagues, Bureau of Market Research colleagues in the audience. I'd like to give them a special word of welcome. And really, excuse me, I think for us, the purpose of this meeting really is to give some feedback. We've had a long conversation with interested parties and stakeholders in the industry about the concept of and the purpose of segmentation of consumers. The current status with having both LSMs and SEMs in the market, is, I think, useful. There are different tools used for different purposes. The feedback we've received from marketers, for instance, and advertisers is that they mostly use LSMs, whilst agencies and media buyers seem to prefer the SEMs. That's not a problem. We don't see it as an issue. What we do understand is that both LSMs and SEMs are due for some kind of an update. LSMs in particular is very, it's been around for quite a while. SEMs have been around for about 7 years, so both of them are starting to get a bit long in the tooth. And there's this need to kind of develop, either refresh those tools or look at a new way of doing market segmentation. And that's really where the MRF is right now. It's looking at these concepts. It's trying to understand what the best way forward is. If you take the LSMs, for example, and you make changes to it, what you essentially would sit with is a new segmentation tool, because it's not the same as the previous one. You lose all trendability, and it essentially, you have to adjust to new measurements around LSM. So the discussion has always been, do we try and update what we have, or do we look for a new innovative approach to segmentation? And this is really where this process comes from. So Professor Karel van Aert at the Bureau of Market Research, who's the research director there, he's been instrumental in working with us in trying to develop a segmentation tool that is and more adaptive and more innovative and more purpose-built for the South African market. So as part of that conceptualization and developing this model, we've had a number of workshops with stakeholders and interested parties in March, April, and May. Many of you might have attended. And we got very valuable feedback from that process. So based on that feedback, we've made some refinements and adjustments to that model. And that's really what today is about. It's just to give you feedback in terms of where we are right now, what the next steps are, where we're taking this, and hopefully, we can come to some kind of a conclusion around process and understanding what's best for the market going forward. Out of the workshops, we got invaluable feedback, and we had great support for the model in principle. I think there was a need for more work to be done and further refinement. So what is being presented today by Prof van Aert is by no means a final product. We're still very much in the development phase, and towards the end, maybe I will, we can cover next steps and the process going forward. So I've said quite a lot, but I thought it was important for those who didn't attend the workshops to understand where we're coming from, what the approach is, and why we're doing this. So it's been a lengthy process, but we want to get it right, and that's important for us. We want to be as inclusive and consultative as we possibly can. Right at the end, we will have a Q&A session, so feel free to put your comments in the comments section, or there's a Q&A section as well where you can load your questions. and we'll answer those questions, or if you have suggestions or some guidance that you want to offer, you're very welcome to do that. We would very much appreciate that. What Prof van Aert is presenting today, you'll see some data in his presentation, quite a bit of data actually. It's based on the next MAPS release, which will come out on the 1st of September. So it's the data set that is just about to be released. But you will note, I think the users of MAPS and the subscribers of MAPS, just take note that there will be some differences in figures because this is a test data set. We'll be playing around with some concepts. So things like total population, for instance, might look different to what you see in the final release on the 1st of September. That's simply because this data set is being used for testing, and there's some variances in some of the data. So, but it is based on the very latest data from MAPS, which will be released on the 1st of September. So in some way, you're getting a bit of a sneak peek in terms of what's to come and what the numbers look like. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Prof. Karel van Aert, who's the Research Director at the Bureau of Market Research, who'll be taking us through this presentation today. Prof. van Aert, very welcome. Thank you once again for all your hard work and on this project and with this model and your guidance and assistance with this. We really appreciate everything that you have done for us, and it's been a pleasure working with you on this thus far. So thank you very much, and I'm going to hand over to you.
Good morning, Johan. Thank you so much, and thanks so much for the opportunity. So what I'll be doing today is just to take you through a presentation. And in this presentation, this will be a more detailed feedback on the multidimensional consumer market segmentation tool that, as Johan indicated, that the BMR has been developing in conjunction with the Market Research Foundation. So it's a fairly detailed presentation, but I will go through it as quickly as possible. But there will be some aspects that I really would like to highlight, which are very important. So what I'll be focusing on is firstly just to provide some background to the segmentation model, why it has been developed. Then secondly, on the how, looking at the market segmentation approach that was taken. Then thirdly is just then actually to delve into the what, namely looking at the mechanics of the BMR consumer market segmentation tool, the methodology, etc. And then I'm going to apply it to some MAPS data so that we can actually see what are the value, what's the value that we can derive from the model. So maybe just firstly as background that, as you know, that consumer market segmentation indices are being used internationally to segment consumer markets, and there are literally thousands of different consumer market segmentation indices out there. In South Africa, the consumer market segmentation index, like the living standard measure, have been used extensively to segment the consumer markets in South Africa for some time. There are also many other consumer market segmentation indices being used in South Africa, and they are mostly based on a single dimension. For example, either income, expenditures, living standards, consumer behavior, etc. While internationally, the movement have been very strongly moving from a single dimension consumer market segmentation index, i.e. just on living standards or income, on a more multidimensional one. And this is especially as new technologies have become available, such as big data, data joining, artificial intelligence, and especially machine learning that have assisted a great deal. And especially here to ensure that the segments that you develop are very homogeneous segments, and especially here that machine learning is very good at producing exactly that. Just for the purposes of the road that we've traveled with the Market Research Foundation, what do we mean by market segmentation? The term consumer market segmentation can be defined as referring to the practice of dividing a consumer market into fairly uniform groups for market information, for market tracking and for marketing purposes. And that's typically like the LSMs that was developed, that was split into LSM1, LSM2, all the way to LSM10. And then different marketers would have been indicating that they are operating in different LSMs. Also, through market segmentation, consumer market subsets are being created based on specific demographics. Like, for example, that when you are marketing cosmetics, a demographic, for example, like gender, could be very important because you might have a much stronger focus on females. Then on customer needs, it might be, for example, that you are actually marketing banking products, and the banking products that you are offering, for example, are to some investment products, and that might be in some of your higher income groups. Also on consumer interest, consumer behavior, socioeconomic characteristics, like, for example, the employment status or educational status, and psychographics. That's becoming more and more important as big data is also more able to uncover the real behavior of people, for example, as it's being picked up in the way that they are selling, consuming, looking at things, etc. However, most market segmentation models have only limited success during their life course due to consumer behavior changing the whole time and being much more complex than can be captured in a segmentation model. And what I need to stress in this regard is that quite a lot of consumer segmentation models are not adaptive. They are not being changed over time. So that would then mean, for example, that they become outdated, possibly during their lifetime. Just why is consumer market segmentation so important? It is important to identify specific markets for your products or your services, and to identify the characteristics of such markets. Very important also then to obtain information of who your market is and what your market would like, and also the psychographics and the demographics of those markets. By tracking different consumer market segments, changes in such market segments can be identified and can be acted upon over time. Also, here is that market segmentation aids in ensuring targeted above the line as well as below the line marketing. And also through market segmentation, detailed knowledge about consumer market segments are being realized. And especially here, that if you've identified who your market is, it becomes possible to really dig deeper into who your market is in terms of demographics, psychographics, preferences, interests, etc. And then also tracking of changes in the consumer market segments become possible, because it might, for example, be that you've got a very relevant product and you've got a big market out there, but suddenly you could find that you're losing market share. And it might, for example, be that the psychographics or the demographics of the market have changed to such an extent that your product is not so much in demand anymore. But then you can identify other markets or other market segments that still have a high demand for your products. Just then on the market segmentation approach that have been taken, is that worldwide you will notice that there are different market segmentation approaches. As already indicated, some are unidimensional, a single dimension, like, for example, income, employment status. Some of them are more multidimensional. Some are more quantitative in the sense, for example, like the LSMs, that you can express that in numbers, while some of that are more qualitative, and there are very powerful qualitative methods out there as well, which describe the markets and market segments qualitatively. Some of them are discrete, which means, for example, that they can't be placed on a spectrum. Some of them are continuous, like the LSMs from LSM1 to LSM10. Some of them are autonomously generated, especially here with machine learning methods, while others are typically done via factor analysis, etc., which is a predefined form of formation. Some are homogeneous. Some of the segments are homogeneous, which means, for example, that you can rest assured that your segment have got similar characteristics. What we often find, for example, that especially with factor analyses, that you do identify segments, but the segments are very heterogeneous because you can't control to ensure, while, for example, machine learning makes it very possible for you to reduce error. Then some of them are dynamic, which means that they evolve over time, and others are static, not evolving over time. The one that we've selected is multidimensional in the sense that there's more than one dimension. It's quantitative. It's both discrete and continuous. I'm going to show you that there are very discrete market segments, but they can also be placed on a spectrum. It's autonomously generated. It's a process of machine learning to generate that. It's also very complex in the sense that it uncovers, for example, the geographic, demographic, socioeconomic, psychographic, and behavioral dynamics. And I'm also going to show you with the segment descriptors of how you can describe your specific segment dynamics in terms of geographics, demographics, etc. And it's an evolving index as well. Just to take you through to what the tool actually looks like. In this tool, as indicated, it's multidimensional. There are two dimensions to this index. The first one is consumption capacity, and this refers to the spending capacity of consumers as proxied by employment status, personal income, and household expenditure. This will correlate to a large extent, for example, with incomes, expenditures, living standards, etc., of consumers. And typically here, this could be split into low consumption capacity, which is typically the volume market there, lower income people, the consumers that with a lower level of expenditures, a middle consumption capacity, possibly the lower parts of your middle income market, and then also high, which is your higher parts of your middle income markets as well as your affluent. Then we're also introducing another principle here of consumption potential, and this refers to the broader human and social capital status of consumers as proxied by educational attainment, digital inclusion, and purchasing styles. So this basically refers then also to the human and the social capital embedded in a person. Let me just indicate to you why this is so important that we've got two dimensions. Let's take, for example, a person with low consumption capacity, which will typically be a poor person. That poor person, for example, could be an older person that's lowly educated, that's mostly staying in the rural areas. The potential for that person to develop is very low. But then you can also have a medical student that just completed his or her medical studies. That person is very poor with a lot of student debt after studies, etc., before beginning to work. However, that person, for example, have got a high consumption potential. So that would then mean that the two people that I've indicated, the one with a low consumption capacity, low consumption potential, versus the other one that's got a low consumption capacity, the doctor, with a high consumption potential, are both in the same socioeconomic class, but they are very different. And by bringing these two axes together, you obtain something like this, in the sense, for example, and this is the full BMR consumer market segmentation structure that goes from that typical person that's poorer, low consumption capacity, low potential here, as I've indicated. That could be a person that's very poor at the moment, but also not highly educated, versus, for example, that medical doctor that I've indicated to you, that's also got a low consumption capacity, but it's got a high potential to develop. Also, what you see here, for example, is that there are basically 9 segments to this, from low consumption capacity to low potential, all the way through to high consumption capacity, which are your more affluent people with a high potential. And high potential here would then typically mean that these people have got a higher level of education, also that they're more digitally included, and that they've got a very careful way of actually conducting shopping. How did we then use the maps data to populate the index? Firstly, as Johan indicated, this is brand new maps data that haven't been released yet. We did a lot of diagnostic testing, and it was also rim weighted. And this was rim weighted in terms of the system of national accounts. And what the system of national accounts is, it's an international statistical system that actually guides the work, for example, of demographers, of econometricians, statisticians, etc. And in terms of that, you have to use your official statistics. And what we used here is the quarterly labor force survey of Statistics South Africa for rim weighting purposes. The 6 variables, and that will be the 3 variables with respect to consumption capacity and the 3 variables of consumption potential, were investigated, scrutinized, and analyzed in a variety of ways. And we also did a lot of parameter checking to ensure that the figures that we had made sense. Then the 3 socioeconomic capacity variables were used in accordance with the machine learning identified index structure developed during early 2022 with 2021 maps data to construct the consumption capacity index. In this case, we've actually, then it's 2021, 2022 data. And then the 3 socioeconomic potential variables were constructed in the same way. And then having constructed the indices and having populated that, we did a lot of investigation to see against administrative data whether it makes sense. And the result of that looks like this. So in terms of this, you'll find, for example, that of your low consumption capacity, that there's about 17.318 million people. And when you do some parameter checking and you look at the actual poverty rates in South Africa, you will see, for example, that that gels to a very large extent with that. When you look, for example, at your high consumption capacity, you will notice that it's much more, for example, than in the LSMs, etc. And when you look, however, at from your quarterly employment survey, you've got just below 10 million people that is currently formally employed. Plus, then you've also got some retirees, etc., some people living off the investments, and that make up about 11.1 million. So that also makes sense. The one thing that I want to show you is that with a lot of other segmentation indices, there's a massive bubble right in the middle. And what you'll see from this is with respect to consumption capacity, that bubble isn't there. So I think that's also a positive part of this model. With respect to consumption potential, you will see that there is 21 million people right in the middle. Taking into account the number of people that have got a matric, that are digitally included, etc., this also makes sense. So these figures make a lot of sense. So what this tells you basically is that right at the bottom of your low consumption capacity, low potential, about 7 million people there. And also then with respect to your high consumption capacity, your high, you've got about 4.2 million people there. So let's have a look, for example, at these various segments, but this time not as separate segments, but as indicated also on a spectrum from low to high. So you can construct this segmentation model in a discrete way, as you can see here that you've got discrete segments, or they can also be placed on a continuum from low incomes to middle incomes to high incomes and also then all the way through from low consumption potential to a high consumption potential out there. So it shows you that the segmentation model can be used in two ways, either in a discrete fashion as well as in a continuous fashion. Also, when you use it in a continuous fashion, that middle bubble isn't there. So this is more conforming to the consumer market from a lot of other metrics that we've got. So you've seen, for example, there that there's about 7 million people in the low consumption capacity, low consumption potential group. And one of the features of this model is that it also allows you to have detailed segment descriptors. So let's just go and see some of the descriptors of who these people are. Firstly, with respect to low consumption capacity, they are poorer and the expenditure is generally more than their incomes, mostly not economically active or they're unemployed. The focus is mostly on buying necessities. The most important needs driving them are physiological as well as safety needs. They require a strong guidance with respect to what they should consume. Very strong in being followers, also looking for leaders, and influencers are very important in this space. It's also important that when you provide information to this group, to do it incrementally. If you communicate a too complex message, it's not going to go home. Keep it simple and specific. Focus on survival needs. And however, keep in mind that this group is very good at budgeting because they've got very little and they need to survive. Sometimes their budgeting doesn't make sense to people on the outside, but it actually makes a lot of sense. Looking at their consumption potential, very low level of education, very low level of digital inclusion, low level of personal maturity, which often makes it very difficult for them to make decisions. A fairly low need to achieve, because in fact, when we ask the question, or when you look at the question as to what is important for these people, they indicate that the most important thing for them is to survive, to get by. They also extrinsically motivated, which means, for example, a very strong external locus of control. They believe that there's forces impacting on their lives. Not really able to adapt. There's also a low level of assertiveness, not really standing up for themselves, low level of self-confidence, low conceptual development, unable and insecure. So when you look, for example, at product and service development for this group, these products and services must mostly be real necessities for this specific group. They must see the value of that in their daily struggle to survive. Also, is that the features of these products and services must be very clearly communicated to this group, and they must be led to a state, for example, where they can actually see the value of that. The very interesting part of this group is that you will also notice from what I'm going to show you that when you look at community newspapers, those inserts are very important to this group because quite a lot of them want to see where bargains are available, where discounts are available, etc., and especially discounts on necessities. On the other side of the spectrum, I've shown you that there's about 4.268 million people with a high consumption capacity, high consumption potential. Who are they? Mostly people with middle to high incomes, mostly formal sector employed or self-employed, as well as I've indicated, there are also some retirees there, people living off the investments. They're buying both necessities and luxuries. Their esteem and personal growth needs are very important. So for this group, conspicuous consumption is still very important. They require little guidance, but if you, for example, try to tell them what to buy, etc., it's not going to work very well. They need a little guidance, but they want to be part of campaigns, etc. They see themselves as leaders. It's very important to nudge their behavior in the direction that you wanted to take them. Also keep it simple and specific, focus on their status and their personal growth. However, what's a very strong feature of this group in South Africa is whereas internationally, your high consumption capacity, high consumption potential group are people that, for example, are big savers, big investors. In South Africa, this is not the case. Very low level of savings among this group, very low level of investments, but quite a lot of overspending here. Just on their potential side, a high to a very high level of education, mostly a matric and higher. Also a high to very high level of digital inclusion, a high level of maturity, a very high need to achieve, and that goes along with the personal growth needs. Intrinsically motivated, also a high level of adaptability, high level of assertiveness, high level of self-confidence, high level of conceptual development, and they are able. And what's also very interesting in South Africa is that internationally, this is a very secure group. In South Africa, there's a lot of things like crime, etc., that also lower the level of security of this group compared to their international counterparts. So let's apply the consumer market segmentation tool to some of the maps data, and this is the data as Johan indicated that will be released soon. Firstly, with respect to when you look at the reading of a newspaper during the past four weeks, you will notice here that the strongest predictor of reading newspapers are people with a middle to high consumption potential. So that level of education is a very strong predictor, and the level of digital inclusion is a very strong predictor of reading newspapers. However, you will notice that on your low to middle consumption potential, that this group is mostly on the paper-based newspaper, moving here to the middle consumption potential to more online newspapers, with your high consumption potential group mostly online newspapers that is being read. Looking at reading a magazine, South Africa is not very high on magazine readership, but as you can see from this, that it's also your middle consumption potential and your high consumption potential that's very strong predictors with respect to reading magazine and not so much consumption capacity. When you look, for example, at watching television, incredibly high rates of television watching in South Africa, all across the spectrum. And what is really, really interesting here is that we would often assume that 11 million people at the lowest level of consumption capacity, the poor, will only be looking, for example, at the state television services. But it's very interesting that a lot of them have got decoders, and especially have got the basic access package that's very strong, featuring there as well, both the state television as also satellite services that they've got here. Then you've got your middle consumption capacity group. A lot of them have got the compact packages, as well as looking some of the SABC services. Then in your high group, you find a very strong penetration, not just of these TV services, but also Showmax and Netflix, etc., coming very strongly through in that specific group there. However, your strongest group with respect to television watching is the people in your middle consumption potential group here, where television is a very strong provider of information. And what was fascinating here is that this group has also got a very high indication that they act on TV commercials in a lot of their decision making that they make with respect to their buying of products. When it comes having access to cell phones, nearly the full adult population of 43.8 million have got cell phones, etc. What's very interesting here is that when you look at the consumption capacity, you will note that 16.55 million there, mostly on prepaid, also mostly not smartphones in this, but a lot of them are feature phones. And as people move in the more affluent categories, that they move more towards contracts, and they also move more towards prepaid with top-up facilities that they've got there. But also here is that in your middle consumption potential group, very strong dominance already there of smartphones, as well is in your high consumption potential group. And the reason for this is the very high digital inclusion of this group. What's fascinating in this regard is that there's also a very strong correlation here between access to smartphones and online buying and online purchasing. And therefore, you would also then, for example, see that especially your middle to high consumption capacity groups, very strong in online buying, as well as your consumption middle and high consumption potential groups, very strong on online buying. Having a look at having a transactional savings account. The one thing that I want to point out to you in this regard is the lots of opportunities at the bottom of the pyramid with respect to consumption capacity. You will notice, for example, there 8.6 million people in the volume market that with a transactional account. And you've seen here, for example, some of the service providers in that space, like Capitec, like Time Bank, etc., doing very, very well. However, we've seen as well that Capitec and Time Bank has also moved up with respect to the consumption capacity, and especially here, looking at consumption potential, that a lot of these providers are moving into that both middle and high consumption potential groups there, etc. Also here is that you will notice that it's not just that people are having more transactional accounts, but people are also becoming more multi-banked. And we've seen especially here that your middle and your high consumption capacity groups and your middle and high consumption potential groups, that's becoming to increasingly multi-banked. Then just looking at the use of e-money services, this is really growing in South Africa. And what we've seen here as well is that when you look at the growth of money supply in South Africa, there's something called M1A that refers mostly to the growth in cash versus M2 and M3, that's mostly non-cash. Very strong growth in the use of non-cash, and that also links up with the fact that more people are actually having a transactional savings account, becoming banked, using that for banking services, as well as having e-money services, and increasingly here as well, a lot of people in your low consumption capacity group that are becoming users of various e-money services. Then with respect to a retail loyalty card, very interesting results. And the BMR will also soon be releasing a consumer market or consumer trends report. And what you can see there is as well that there has been huge growth because of more and more consumers becoming financially vulnerable in your volume market. And what is very clear from this is that your volume market are becoming increasingly dependent for survival on loyalty cards, and especially here, loyalty cards that provide instant discounts. And we've seen, for example, that penetration. So this is a rapidly growing market, especially in your low consumption capacity group there. And also here in your middle consumption potential group, that is also becoming very strong as more of these people are really financially struggling as well. And they also then use loyalty cards as a basis for survival. Then just looking at people buying bread, and it's very clear here that as we can expect, for example, your low consumption capacity group, because of more people in that, also because of that more people buying necessities, but then also your middle consumption potential group, increasingly dependent upon bread for survival. And we've seen, for example, that at the moment where there's a lot of people losing their jobs, etc., that the dependence on basic necessities have increased dramatically. Then just looking at the use of soap, as you can see that the penetration is right throughout the spectrum in South Africa, and especially here of your middle consumption potential group, where it's nearly 100% penetration of soaps. And then also of cosmetic makeup. Very interesting. Just have a look at the large number of people in your low consumption capacity group that's also buying makeup. It's nearly the same as your middle consumption capacity group. And this has got an aspirational component to that. And a lot of these people have also indicated that they're viewing cosmetics increasingly as a necessity, because if they look better, their chances of obtaining jobs, of, for example, obtaining other income generating opportunities is just so much more. So having gone through the presentation, having gone through the model that has been developed by the BMR in collaboration with the Market Research Foundation, just some concluding remarks. The figures that I've shown you have been parameter checked. Now, in terms of the system of national accounts, before you release figures, you go and check that against administrative figures, against national accounts figures, of national accounts figures from the Stats SA, as well as flow of funds figures from the Reserve Bank. And the model structure conforms to some of the national accounts and flow of funds figures. Also, the consumer market segmentation tool, because of the detailed segment descriptors that's available, provides actionable insights into consumer spending power and behavior. And it allows you to actually identify your consumers for your specific products, and then to identify, for example, who your consumers are in terms of demographics, of geographics, of psychographics, etc. Also, it's just that it's possible to impute the consumer market segmentation tool into other data sets or in company data sets that you might have, as also to use this for segment tracking purposes, or to generate segment insights. And the way typically to do that is that you might have a data set of your own. You will first impute the consumer market segmentation model, this model, into that data set, and then you will then use the segment descriptors from the MAPS data to describe the consumers in your own data set. And then also is that increasingly you will find, for example, that the consumer market segmentation tool can be linked with big data in order to determine the impact of changing preferences on consumer behavior. And remember, big data out there is typically like also your social media data, behavioral data, data from the credit bureaus, etc., that could all be used in conjunction with this. So thank you so much for your very, very kind attention. And so this was just a fairly quick run through a long process. And I also just want to say thank you to everybody that made the recommendations and inputs along the way. And as you can see, I think we've included your various inputs. Johan, back to you, and thanks so much for the opportunity.
Carl, thank you very much. Appreciate that. I think that was very insightful and very useful. I hope everyone finds it as insightful as I did. And I think there's great potential for this tool in the South African market. The questions that we've received, we'll get to just in a minute. I just want to quickly just talk you through in terms of what next, because I think there might be some questions in terms of the process and where we're going with this and what this all means, and how we kind of take this to market eventually. So let me first say that this tool is still very much in the developmental phase. There's quite a bit of consulting we still need to do. It's a concept we're testing in the market. We've had all these consultations. We're getting lots of feedback. But at this stage, we feel it seems to be very solid and stable, and the work that the BMR has done in that regard has been excellent to help us arrive at this point. So next for us really is to start testing the data and to start allowing users to play with this tool. So the first phase of that would be having a small pilot group of users, of heavy users of the maps data, to start using the tool and giving us feedback and insights on that. Once that's done, we'll expand that group to kind of a stretch group, make it a bit wider, get their insights and input, see if we can maybe roll that out to some of the media data that's out there, media surveys that's out there, but that consultation and process still needs to, and discussions still need to happen. And once we've concluded all of that and we have had an opportunity to kind of assess that feedback and make whatever necessary adjustments there are, we will then look at putting this up to market. The intent of this tool is not to replace anything that's out there already. It's not intended to replace SEMs. It's not intended to replace LSMs. It will take quite a long time for this tool, if it is made available and rolled out to the market, to gain traction. It will take some time for it to build data and trendability. So, we see an environment where this runs in parallel with a number of other tools that are available out there. And at some point in future, we as the MRF, might decide that, okay, there's sufficient traction and there is sufficient weight behind this tool and it's doing its job sufficiently well that we might say, for instance, decide to stop using LSMs. But that's way into the future. So I think that's the process we're looking at. It's it's a slow process, but as I said in the beginning, we want to get it right, and we want to make sure that what we put out there is useful, it's usable, it's relevant to the South African market, it's usable in different surveys, and adds value, especially for marketers and agencies and third parties as well. So, Prof van Aert, there are quite a few questions. I'm gonna run through them. There was one question or a few questions which I think I should answer, which is more to do with maps as the data that was used in this survey or in this presentation. So the marketing all products survey was used, the latest release, which is coming out in 2 days' time. That data was used and reweighted according to the BMR approach as was explained by Prof van Aert. So it's a slightly different rim weighting than is currently used in maps, but it's a concept that we are testing. In terms of the methodology behind maps, there was a question around that. The audience that was used in arriving at this data is 20,000 interviews were conducted, face-to-face interviews across the country, completely random representative sample over a 12-month period. There's a face-to-face component to the survey, and there's also an online component to this survey. That data is then fused into a data set of 20,000 respondents, It's updated quarterly, so it's a rolling 12-month sample. Every quarter we publish add data from a new quarter, and we drop off the old quarter. So that's how these figures were arrived at. I think the figure of 43 million that you see in the population, the total population, is exactly that. It's total population figures derived from the latest population updates that are available. It's for people aged 15 and older who are interviewed in this survey. So that's the base data. That's a bit of background on MAPS. There's a lot of information on MAPS and how we do things on the MRF website, mrfsa.org.za. You're welcome to go have a look there. There are lots of presentations there, also technical reports there that will give you some background on that. If you have any questions, feel free to pop us an email and reach out to us. Then, Prof, question for you. How did you arrive at the descriptors, characteristics or traits for the consumption capacity and potential? This is from Nashin. Maybe you would want to answer that question as well. And then there was a question from him as well, or from Nashin as well, in terms of the television watching figures. Are those for linear watching? Or I suppose that is something you can answer as well. Is it just linear, or is it all watching, including catch up as well? Prof, do you want to answer those two so long? I don't want to overload you with questions.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, Johan. Just on the first two, it's just that the first question is, how did we arrive at the descriptors of the consumption capacity and consumption potential? I'm not exactly sure if it's being referred to the segment descriptors or to the scale descriptors. So the scale descriptors, for example, on consumption capacity, as you've seen, was employment status, as well as income, as well as expenditure. And the reason why those three were included is that when you apply a machine learning process of k-means clustering, and you try to identify which of the things, for example, both uniquely as well as in total have got the strongest prediction value of the consumption capacity of a person. Those three variables came out very, very strongly. And what we then did is that we, on employment status, we couldn't assume that the MAPS data reflects the figures of the quarterly labor force survey. So as indicated, we first did parameter checking and we improved on that. Then there's also the segment descriptors, and those are typically what I've shown you on the socioeconomic status. So what we did is that we analyzed each of the segments. And in the segments, you could, for example, see where the bulk of the people are staying in a specific segment, what their employment status are of that, etc. Okay, so there were quite a lot of them. The ones that we couldn't get from the MAP survey was specifically the psychographic descriptors, etc. Some of them we could, for example, on whether the purchasing style of a person, the level to which they are intrinsically motivated, etc. But then what we also did is that we harvested a lot of other data that's available out there, that and we imputed the same model into that data to derive from that. And we will be doing this more and more, because what we're trying to do is that we're trying to create a situation where different data sets can talk to one another. So, and that's also, for example, that we ensure, for example, that the MAPS data that we've got conform to the labor market data, conform to the income and expenditure data. And so that's how that's being derived. Johan, the question versus the linear and the catch-up, I'm not exactly sure that I understand that question.
Prof, I think the data that you've presented is all TV watching, right? So it's anyone who's
That's
watched TV
correct.
in the
Yeah,
past 4 weeks. So that would include both linear and catch-up watching. Catch-up is where on
correct.
your
Yeah.
PVR you've saved some content for later viewing. So that would include both. I think the figure
Yeah.
that you've presented. So that's
Sorry,
total
my
penetration.
media knowledge is not so good. Sorry.
And that's fine. Absolutely not a problem. I just want to make sure I don't skip any questions here. I hope I've answered adequately on the base data and the 43 million population figure. We had a comment from Megan who said it would be useful to see those the size of the segments also in percentages. So maybe Prof and Art, that's something we can take on board in the presentation and maybe include some percentages there, just rather than those big numbers. And then there's a question here from Karen Sneyman, who's asked that whether we've seen in our data shifts of the high group. She suggests that from their data, in-house Woolworths data, that they're seeing an effect on the total market size, things like high-end households leaving the country or shifting from Gauteng to the Western Cape, but she hasn't been able to gain any access data supporting this. So I think from our side as MAPS, we also definitely start seeing population shift. There's specific questions in the questionnaire that talks to moving from rural to urban, from moving between provinces. So there is means within the MAPS data to track movement internally. It's difficult to track someone moving out of the country because we can't really reach them to ask those questions. But there is definitely shifts that we are seeing at that higher end of the market. Prof, I'm sure you would want to elaborate on that.
Yeah, thank you so much for that, and thank you so much for that recommendation of the percentages. I will really take that on board. This is very important. Johan and myself have also been struggling with a bad habit of mine, and the bad habit is putting everything in tables. And Johan said as well that we should look at a much better way to. So that's my fault. And so Johan indicated, Johan, you can maybe provide more details on that. But you recommended to me yesterday that you and the MRF would be looking at more customer-friendly ways to give the data that I've provided in tables.
Yeah, certainly, Prof. I think that will be part of the feedback sessions or the feedback environment that we want to create. So, once the users start using the data, that feedback will be looped back into how I think the descriptors and how you visually present the data, all of that still needs some work. So we know that, but we didn't want to be too prescriptive. We want that kind of creativity to come from the users. So we'll definitely look at that, Prof.
Thank you. And then just on the shifts. Yes, there are incredible shifts. At the Bureau of Market Research, we've also got a household wealth research division with a huge personal income database. And the data is available in that from 2011 all the way to 2022. And from that, you can clearly see the various shifts. For example, what happened also with the impact of COVID. You remember that there was a loss of 2 million jobs during 2020, and there was some catch-up that has been happening in the meantime. But a lot of high-end people, high-end income earners also lost their jobs, and as you indicated, also migrated out of South Africa. So you can clearly see, for example, that pattern. But what is counterintuitive at the moment is that what you also saw over time is that South Africa during 2019 had nearly the most unequal income distribution. There's something called the Gini coefficient that gives an indication, and that was at 0.64, which is with that means that your incomes are incredibly unequally distributed in South Africa. And currently, it's at about 0.74. So that would then mean is just that people that did maintain their jobs and maintain their businesses, etc., became very well off, while your volume market grew dramatically during this period. creating more inequality, and that's inequality with respect to both incomes as well as the household balance sheets during that period. But I fully agree that's very important to track those various segments. If you, for example, impute the segments into earlier MAPS data, Johan, we'll also be able then to track what has happened during the full time that MAPS data have been available.
Certainly, Prof. There are no more questions that I can see. If I've missed your question, please forgive me. But I think we've covered all of it. Prof, are there any questions from your side, perhaps? Any insights, other insights that you would like to share?
Thank you so much for the opportunity, and this is one of my favorite parts of asking questions. And my question to you is that you've seen the index and the way that we've developed that over time, etc. And I've seen that there's a lot of positive remarks. But my question to you is that what do you believe should be done to make it even better? Have you got specific needs? The first need that you've already expressed is that you want this to be done in a tracking fashion, which means that you must have more time points of MAPS data with the segmentation in to actually do that. The other thing that you've mentioned, for example, is that very good question of where the segment descriptors come from, etc. And it appears that that's also something that's very important for you. But are there other things that you would really like to have included in this model that you're not seeing at present? And thanks so much for that recommendation on the percentages as well.
While you think about that, and maybe type your comments and feedback in the comment section if there is anything you would like us to consider or add to the model. Prof van Aert, I think one of the most important elements of this model is its ability to adapt, right? Its ability to constantly change with the changing economic environment, the psychographics, the behavior of consumers. So I would like maybe you just want to explain to the audience just very briefly what this means in terms of having a stable model that you don't have to review periodically, that you don't have to, that doesn't come with kind of hindrances over time like we have with LSMs and some of the other models out there. How adaptive is it, and is there a danger there that there would be a shift to such an extent that you also lose trendability?
Thanks for that question, Johan. It's just that in a consumer market segmentation modeling, one of the first things that you have to ask yourself is that the variables underlying your models, to what extent are they variable? Let's say, for example, that one of the things that you're tracking over time is whether a person, for example, have got a television set in the home, have got a fridge in the home, etc. There's continuously new technologies that, for example, could be replacing the television set as we know today, that could be replacing the fridge as we know it today, etc. So to keep a model like that current, the one thing that you would need to do is to continuously remove some of the variables and add new variables, etc. But what you will notice from the model that we're presenting here is that, let's take, for example, the three aspects of consumption capacity. The first indicator is employment, okay? When you look, for example, at the seminal work in the 1700s of Adam Smith, you will notice that he already indicated the value of employment status as a predictor of incomes, etc. Then you've got incomes as well, and that also comes all the way through from the 1700s, as well as total household expenditure. Okay, so in this model now, what you've got is that you don't need to revise those three things, because they will remain relevant for many years to come. So that would then mean that as more people become employed, as more people obtain incomes and more people spend more, etc., there'll be a move through of those people across the various segments. When you take the consumption potential part, okay, here you've got digital inclusion, you've also got educational status and purchasing style as a psychographic variable, etc. Of those three, education would remain relevant for years to come, because there's been a lot of human capital theories, for example, of many years showing, for example, that education has got an impact on how people earn money, on how they consume, etc. Then also, for example, when you look at purchasing style and digital inclusion, that might change over time, okay? But in the digital inclusion scale, it might be that that we would have to include other things than, for example, what we're tracking at the moment. Because typically what we're tracking is whether a person has got a smartphone, a cell phone, a tablet, a laptop computer, a television set, a decoder, etc. So that might change over time. So that variable would have to be adapted. However, the purchasing style one, when you, and this is based on a lot of the economic theory still coming from the Austrian school in the 1947 of Friedrich Hayek, that and they refer to consumer preferences, and they basically and he spoke of a very interesting concept. He referred to the endogeneity of consumer preferences, which means that it comes from within that specific person, etc. And that has been shown to be very constant. So the only of those 6 variables that that have to be adapted over time is the digital inclusion one. We had a lot of chats about that one, etc., because my preference, purely from a system of national accounts, is to replace that with another variable that doesn't change over time. However, we need the digital inclusion one. So I would rather run that risk, etc. But the other variables, Johan, are variables that will remain fixed in the model. But as people evolve, as people become develop higher human capital, higher social capital, their potential will shift. And as they, for example, get jobs, high incomes, expenditures, that will shift as well. And that makes the model also excellently trendable over time to see, for example, how those 9 segments evolve over time.
Great, thanks, Prof. Comment here from, I think you've potentially answered this question, but a question from Anne, who said, could you please elaborate a bit more on the consumption potential scale, which I think you've partially or probably answered right now. And then from Henny van Niekerk, who said, we possibly need more clarity on the potential scale. Is it a construct? And then Belinda Vosloo, who said vehicle ownership might also be a good variable to define and track segments. Anna said her question is answered, Prof, so we're good there. Belinda, comment on vehicle ownership as a possible variable. Carl, what's your thoughts?
Okay, firstly, let's just go to the potential one. You all know the history. The original variable, the original name that we called this axis is human development, because that's exactly what it is. But that's not a PC word. And so, and for that, we were looking at the variety of names. And I don't know, Johan, how many names we arrived at over time. But your consumption potential is basically human development. And so your human development index internationally, that's also includes some of these variables. And that's a good indication, for example, of how your consumers develop over time. So, Henny, I fully agree. It's just that the word consumption potential is for me still not an optimal word, but the correct word is human development, but we may not use that term. And on the one with respect to vehicle ownership, to some extent, sorry, that's a very good recommendation. But when you look, for example, at especially of your variables such as labor market status, the level of employment, income, and expenditure. Those are also strong proxies for vehicle ownership, but I will definitely be exploring the strength of the correlation with the consumption capacity scale. But thanks for that recommendation.
And Carl, a suggestion here that maybe including a type of savings or investments that consumers have.
Okay, Johan, just more detail on that. Is that as also as part of the consumption capacity scale?
I'm not sure. Deji, I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Do you want to elaborate on that? Yeah, yes, as part of the scale, Carl.
Okay.
So the type of banking products that you have for saving and investments, things like that.
Yeah, this sounds like a very good recommendation. Is there any possibility that you can just send me by email exactly what she's recommending? Because then, Johan, if she could maybe send it to you and you send it on to me, that because I'm always looking for recommendations to see how we can strengthen the scale.
Okay, happy to do that. If you don't mind just passing on those comments and the question, maybe just elaborate a little bit on that. You can send it to mrf@mrfsa.co.za. That's the easiest email address to remember. Yeah. And then Anne's asked, is there a document for further reading into the detail behind the two dimensions, you know, the scales and the descriptors? And so we'll make the presentation available. I think some of these, especially the descriptors, are still under development. I think we've got the two poles of the scale at the moment kind of well defined. The challenge is not, you know, finding the points in between, and that's something that we're still working on. But there is, I mean, we'll share the presentation to everyone that's joined us today. You're welcome to send us questions and suggestions on that, and you know, we'll get Prof van Aert to respond to your questions if we are at the MRF unable to do so. So thank you for that suggestion. And like I said, you know, this is all about feedback and getting input and comment in terms of evolving this to a product that we think would be useful in the market. There's quite a bit of work still that needs to happen, and a lot of testing and piloting that will happen. So some of these concepts that you've raised and ideas that you've put forward, we really do appreciate, and we'll certainly look into those. I think, Prof, there's that brings us, I think, more or less to the end of today. To everyone that's joined, able to give you back a few minutes. Thank you so much for participating. Thank you for joining us for the day and for the valuable feedback that you've given. We will send out the presentation and a link to the recording, so you can go back and have a look and listen and share with colleagues and friends. And please, you know, send us through your comments and questions that you might have. So with that said, thank you to everyone for your time, and have a great day and great rest of the week.
Thank you, everybody. Keep well.